you joining us. This is our first of the webinar series in 2026, and we decided to do something a little different than we have done in the past. Because you've attended our previous sessions, it's a lot of me chatting away with some PowerPoint slides and trying to give you some insights in terms of what we believe is important when it comes to innovation management performance. I've invited a couple of my very good friends and colleagues to join me today. So Jennifer Dunn, who's based in Oklahoma, and Chris, as you heard, based in Liverpool. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what we would do if we were starting our innovation management programs afresh. And we were starting at the start of the year thinking, well, what are the most important foundational pieces that really are critical when it comes to establishing an effective program? All three of us have been innovation management practitioners in the past. We've all been running innovation projects and taken that innovation management role, innovation management leadership positions. But we're also now in a situation where all three of us are advising other organizations on what to do, how to do it, and speaking from our experience and trying to transfer best practices from one place to another. So I think this is going to be a really fun discussion. It's the first time we've done it in this way. I hope you will, find some value from the discussion we have. To kick us off, I'm just going to ask, firstly, Chris to introduce himself, and then Jennifer, and then I will introduce myself for any of those people that don't know me already.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Docherty, as already mentioned, from the UK. I've been working in innovation now for 20 years, full time. Amazing. And I started my journey with Cargill, looking after innovation across all the different European business units. And then I moved into different consultancies and software vendors like Imaginatic, Hype, and Planbox, etc. But along the way, it's just been really enriching to work with so many different companies, including Formula One, life sciences, pharma, and now a big project with UK government departments. So every day is very different, and looking forward to having a chat with you people today.
All right, over to Jennifer.
Yeah, hi everyone. Jennifer Dunn. I am part of the consulting team here at Hype. Actually started this journey almost 15 years ago. 5 years as an innovation program manager at a hospital, CTCA. That's actually where I met Hype, but only after I made several missteps in my early days of managing innovation. So I always say I kind of learned by walking through the fire a little bit, which is why taking a role with Hype to help others maybe avoid some of those missteps was really compelling. So, like Chris, really excited to start the conversation today and see how we can support you maybe moving forward.
Great. And so that leaves me. I know from some of the names I can see many people know me already, but for those of you who don't know me, I'm Colin Nelson. I'm Chief Innovation Consultant here at Hype. And my role really is around the people and process of innovation performance and how do we drive great outcomes for our innovation programs. My background, I was a former corporate entrepreneur within a large Japanese technology company for some years. For the last 25 years or so, I've been acting in various different roles, but typically advising other folks about how to improve their innovation programs and scale them up and make them systemic. A couple of other things that might be of interest to you. I sit on the BSI committee here in the UK for innovation management standards. So I'm a passionate believer in the ISO standards for innovation management. That's 56,000 if you're interested. I will touch on that very briefly in a moment. Second thing is I'm also a founding member of the Institute of Innovation Management Professionals here in the UK. And Hype is a proud supporter of that group as we start to try to modernize and professionalize our industry and ensure that we have good careers for corporate innovators, which perhaps weren't necessarily there when we all started our careers. Just a quick point of administration. We will be inviting you to share questions as we go through today. If possible, we will answer them in turn. We'll also be having a bit of discussion between the three of us, but please feel free at any point in time. Please do feel free to put your questions into the chat, and I will try to, at some point in time during the session, answer them. It may not be exactly when you ask them, it may be at the end, or if we run out of time, it may be after the session. We are just going to be focused on our three main topics, which I introduce you to in a second. Second point of administration, as you be familiar with, for those of you who've attended sessions before, is that for anybody that fills in a little survey, at the end of this session, we offer a randomly selected free consultation. And I really enjoy doing these. I'm often getting to meet people that I've never met before, and I can talk and help and support and hopefully offer you some guidance on any aspect of innovation management. So at the end of the session, I'll bring this QR code back and I'd ask you to maybe complete it, give us a bit of feedback, and indicate if you'd be interested in something like that. So without any further ado, I'm just going to briefly explain where we are fitting within this whole innovation landscape and which areas we're going to focus in and zoom in on today. And there's three big topics that we're going to address. I'll go first, then we'll move on to Jennifer, and then finally ending up with Chris. And what I'd like to is, you will have heard me talk about these innovation building blocks. For those of you familiar with the ISO 56001, 56002 standards, you'll be able to see there's a whole range of things that we need to do in terms of improving our innovation programs. But it really boils down to 14 key building blocks, which are listed on this slide here. Underneath innovation governance and strategy, there are 5 different things that are really critical. And then under these 5 different clusters of innovation activity, external signals, innovation portfolio, innovation processes, culture and climate, and the external ecosystem. Now, I'm not going to dig into anything more than that, just to say that we are a big believer in aligning to ISO standards. It isn't the entire picture for what we need to focus on, but it does give us a lot of good recommendations to get these structural things correct. But in terms of today, to help you orientate, we're going to be focusing on 3 zones specifically. So innovation portfolio, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in terms of how I might initiate my plan for the year around innovation portfolio, what's important, what I might want to address, what I might want to put in place. Moving on to Jennifer, she's going to look at a slice of the culture and climate zone, particularly around engaging your people and harnessing collective intelligence. And then we will end up with Chris, who will talk about harnessing and processing external signals, which is becoming increasingly important as we live within this world of high levels of volatility and quite fast-moving change. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there for now. I will bring back that QR code for anybody that wants to potentially get a free consultation later. I'm going to start by introducing our first topic of the day. And this is all about engaging people in the innovation portfolio. And the innovation portfolio is kind of a pet topic of mine. It's often the thing that holds a lot of organizations back from effectively implementing rounded innovation programs, not having clarity over what we're working on, who's working on it, what's the investment in, what's the capacity we're applying to our innovation work. Really does stifle our ability to talk effectively to leadership about the value that we're expecting to see. And it's an area that, for the majority of the organizations I'm working with, this is a common starting point. So in terms of planning our innovation programs for 2026, my first recommendation is to take a careful look at how you're managing and providing governance over your innovation portfolio. Now, there's a set of reasons why this has become sort of problematic for many companies. But it's often rooted in the fact we've traditionally devolved responsibility to innovation down to people who are close to the client, close to the external signals, to be able to adapt and pivot and be as flexible as we possibly can. The challenge with that is often is at the expense of transparency. We don't necessarily know at the top levels of our organizations what is it we're working on and why are we working on it. And that can mean that divisions innovate on the same things. It can mean that we focus on more incremental things rather than things that might protect the long-term future of the company. It may be that we find 10 AI projects that are all in different teams that are all essentially very similar or the same, but because the cost of entry for that world is so low, they've kind of bubbled up organically, and we're now spending way more time and more capacity on those things than we would like. The other thing that I think is quite interesting is, what is it we want our organizations to be about? And I think, again, one of the things we suffer from can be a lack of understanding of what our assets and competencies are. So that when we look at what goes into our innovation portfolio, which projects and concepts we're funding, we should also be cognizant of what is that actually aligns to where we can feasibly operate in a meaningful way, and how does that align to our overall corporate strategy. So The general trend now is to try and create a single source of the truth for innovation work, which isn't necessarily removing the process ownership or the activity that exists down in the different silos, which create more transparency for those people that need it, so that we can see where our innovation investments are going. Sometimes the big opportunity is to say, let's stop the duplication of work. That would be a great win for everybody. We can improve our capacity if we do that. Secondly, we also have a much better idea about working out where the opportunities for new innovations are likely to be. We'll be able to see where our energy is going and perhaps where it's also not going. So if we start to listen better to external signals, we'll have a better idea about where we want to investigate. So it's really helpful for leadership to see that consolidated forecast of everything that we're working on currently, our expected return from that portfolio, and what sort of timeline we're working towards, and what sort of magnitude these concepts are. So we've got a sense of how risky or not that portfolio may be. It's fair to say through my work that most organizations do not have a clear view at a corporate level where their innovation investments are going. We typically set targets, financial targets for a division or a team, and say, I don't care how you get there, just get there. The challenge we have now with this fast-moving, volatile world is that we do really need to understand where our energy is going, because if we're not aligning our innovation efforts to the corporate strategy and the innovation strategy, that can cause us problems later on. What happens when we invest and then the world moves, we have to pivot. And without knowing what we're working on and what other options are available to us, it makes that pivoting process much more challenging. So I think the other thing, and I've touched on this in the past, is to say that business leaders often don't understand innovation. They put weak or ineffective targets on innovators, and often it's because they're not presented with the right data. So if we have that single source of the truth for our innovation efforts, and we have what I call a minimum viable set of innovation data, so this is things like money in, money out, impact, timeline, and an independently assessed judgment on the quality or likelihood of our concepts, it makes it much easier for them to understand, all right, well, of these 10 projects, we're expecting this return, and we're not sure exactly which of the 10 are going to be successful, but we know that in the aggregate, we should be able to get the commercial or the impact benefit that we want to see. The other thing to bear in mind is, of course, we can't predict the future. We can try to listen better, to be more anticipatory, but doing long-term strategic planning is becoming increasingly difficult. I used to be able to stand at conferences and ask people to give me a sense of what the next 3 years, 5 years, or even 10 years would look like. Right now, it's hard to even know what the next 6 months is going to look like. So as the world shifts, we need to be able to pivot and adjust. And that also means managing what I call an innovation shelf. Those are the things that's a home for good stuff that we're choosing not to do right now, but we may choose to do if something that we're working on fails, or we need to pivot and adjust. So just to summarize before I open up for some questions, and I know my colleagues are interested in digging into this a little bit, we need to create some categorizations, stages to make sure that we know what a proof of concept is. We know if we're in a business case phase. We know if we're in customer validation. So we have some common language there across the organization. The common language is more important than the common process. You know, certain things are going to require different processes to get from idea through to implementation. But common categorization, and we have that single source of the truth and that minimum viable innovation data, that's going to be sufficient. And at some point, we're going to have to make this mandatory, because unless we do that, people are going to hide stuff. Of course, people are going to not feel like this is the most important thing to do. But without that transparency, it's very difficult to know if we should shift our strategy or do something completely different than what we're doing right now. So if we can tie funding and capacity approvals to that activity, so yes, if you want to progress from this stage to that stage, you need to have your project in this one place. If you want more money, you're going to have this project in one place. That, of course, is going to be critical. So let me pause. I've rambled on long enough, and I'm going to invite my colleagues to ask any questions that they have of me.
So, Colin, how do you get people to share concepts that they're working on? You know, what are the barriers? What would make them want to do it?
Yeah, it can feel like it's never the most important job. and this is the biggest hurdle for organizations to create that single source of the truth. How do we get people to share what they're working on? Now, organizations have tried different tactics. At one end is the carrot. If you do this, potentially there's more budget available to you, there's more support available to you. And I think for most organizations, that should be the tone that we're striking. If you want access to the Good Corporate Innovation Fund, or you want more capacity, then this is the process you have to follow. That won't necessarily solve every aspect, but it does help. Other organizations take the opposite view, which is they just make it mandatory. And they say anything that is going to take money or people, time away from the day job, has to go through this process. But what they try to do is, especially in medium to large organizations, instead of having one committee that's making all the decisions on everything that's shared, instead what they do is they have a hierarchy. So within a particular division, everything will be shared in one place. We've got that transparency, but the local divisional leadership will approve yes or no, adhering to the corporate policy for, all right, this is the business case stage, this is the level of detail we're expecting, this is where we're gonna get approvals for certain money or capacity to get done. So there's a balance to be struck between carrot and stick. I like carrot for as long as we can do that, and then eventually we start to bring stick in. But also try not to ask for too much information, you know. I would never ask them to share absolutely everything associated with a concept or project. Instead, I'd be saying, just give me the minimum numbers, give me what is it you're trying to do, what problem are you solving, what's the impact you're expecting, very high level. Allow them to run their own processes as they see fit, but just share slices of that data in the same place. Ask them to update it maybe no more than once a month or once a quarter, depending on your cycle times, just to make sure it's not burdensome to them as far as possible. Great question.
Yeah, maybe I'll follow up because this is one I've gotten before. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So how do you decide which of the concepts you're going to fund or accept and which ones to leave on a shelf?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting point, because how often do organizations actually decide and be deliberate about how are we going to decide what to fund? And what's the basis for that judgment? I think we've probably all worked for organizations where the stuff that gets funded is, let's say, a pet project of somebody. It's, senior leaders they wanted to get that done, and it's not gone through any rigor of process. And that can lead to people being disengaged to the overall program, lack belief in it, feel like this is not a meritocracy where the best stuff gets done. There is always a balance to be struck between, I would say, levels of adventure. So we think about our horizon model or our Ansoff matrix. So we think about our incremental projects, our strategic projects, our more radical projects, and making sure we have defined capacity for each. As people have heard me say before, I'm not a believer in that 70-20-10 ratio. I think that golden ratio is now out of date, but I am a believer in having dedicated, allocated capacity to each of those zones so that we can make sure that we're populating each of them in parallel. So be deliberate about what we're going to decide to fund and not. And then, as I mentioned earlier, be very clear about what our assets and competencies are. What is it we want to leverage? What do we want our business to be about? And this is a key thing that not enough businesses take into account is, let's go and source what we're good at. Let's go and source what our competencies and capabilities are. And then we know what filter we're going to put things through. And if we can't deliver it, do we have good partners who can help us? Or is this just something that we shouldn't pursue at all? It's just not our world. Any other questions? So I'll just pick up on Rex's question here about companies like Amazon. Yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of companies have very decentralized innovation programs and innovation everywhere. And I think there is a balance to be struck, okay? This isn't about taking the ownership away from the local. It's not about taking all control away. It's about increasing transparency, and certainly at a certain level. And so some organizations will say, below this level of investment, below this level of capacity, do whatever you like. But above this level, we are going to expect you to share, the big stuff, the medium-sized stuff, so that we make sure we're not creating multiple silos of doing the same thing. This is especially a challenge at the moment with AI projects, where the threshold for entry is so low, it requires almost very, very little budget, very little capacity. Maybe it's just throwing some data at something. You find that actually we've got multiple projects in parallel, all flowing up all over the place, and it just doesn't seem to make any sense not to have a bit more coordination about that. All right, so I think we've probably rambled on that topic a little bit more. I'm going to hand on over to Jennifer to talk about employee engagement. And thank you for your questions. We'll see if we've got time to dig into those at the end.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm going to just jump right in. When Colin was talking, obviously the portfolios are going to give us clarity on all the great work that we're doing. But the truth is the people in the organization determine whether that work goes anywhere, right? So the reason I wanted to talk about employee engagement is, especially in these early days of the year when we're starting to think, what are we going to point this capability at? What we tend to see is that employee engagement is the difference between innovation looking good on paper and innovation that actually sticks, right? It's the core, it's a core capability because it determines whether people are going to contribute their ideas, if they're going to commit to that change. Maybe it's sharing those things, right? So there's a lot of change management that kind of happens behind the scenes. And so if we can have them committing to change, it means that it's going to improve the adoption of the efforts that we're trying to put forward. It also means that they're going to carry that business, the innovation efforts into the business. So that follow through piece is really, really important. But before we get into the tactics, I just wanted to start with a simple truth that I think most of you, if you're working in innovation, you've already thought about, you already know this. Innovation is personal, right? It asks people to rethink their habits, maybe take some risks, spend some time on things that might not work at the end of the day. And all of that is on top of their day jobs. And when we see the world around us changing so fast with all of the different disruptions that are going on, it can feel like a lot. And that's why I think this employee engagement piece matters so much. It's not necessarily just a culture topic. But because engagement is what determines, whether people feel they have the agency to share something. Do they feel safe to contribute? Do they believe that their voice really matters? Do they trust that something's actually going to happen if they do speak up? So I'm curious, how does it feel in your organization? Have you seen this kind of drop in engagement? Is it something that's caught your attention or maybe not? But maybe if you don't mind sharing in the chat, it'd be interesting to see how many of you feel like this is something that, you're keeping your eye on, that it might be a little bit of a challenge. The reason I asked that question is because when you look at Gallup's most recent report, they show that engagement fell to 21% in 2024. So what does that mean? That means 1 in 5 people are really in it, right? It's a sad statistic, but it's something we need to be aware of. And it can sound engaging, but actually I think it's clarifying because it means that our biggest opportunity isn't just launching more innovation activity. It's focusing on creating conditions where people want to participate, where that participation is going to turn into momentum for us. So today, what I wanted to do was share 4 different approaches that we've seen work really well. Building a regular cadence to harness your collective intelligence, using different campaign modes depending on what it is that you need, making sure that you're closing the loop, but also having some leadership humility along the way. And so the first thing we've learned going back to the building a regular cadence is if you only ask occasionally, it can feel a little bit like innovation theater. Whereas if you're asking consistently, maybe monthly, maybe quarterly, it becomes part of the way you work, right? It becomes more part of the culture of the organization. And so people start noticing, they start contributing and improving things more proactively. So some things that...
Yeah, I was just going to interrupt, Jennifer, because I think it's a really interesting observation. And I wanted just to share my experience, and maybe you can build upon that from Shashada here, which is in my organization, engagement is high, but the challenge is the flow of ideas that are more incremental versus transformative. How should we engage employees more, and how should we change behavior to make sure we get better ideas? I think there's multiple layers of that. And I wanted to make the observation that engagement isn't just about generating ideas, right? It could be about problem solving. It could be about validation of something we're already working on. idea generation is just one use case. And I personally found that if you involve people in terms of solving problems and validating, they get used to the approach. Then when you start later on asking the more adventurous questions, they're more likely to come to the party. But if you only ever sort of ask them for ideas, that you tend to sort of empty the well eventually. It's all about building confidence in the process that we can deal with these bigger, more complex topics. But please feel free to speak to that in your experiences, because I know you've done a lot of this.
Yeah, 100%. And we're getting to that. So let's see. So the first is consistency, just to finish that thought. Pick a cadence that's sustainable, anchor it with a repeatable leadership prompt, like maybe what are we missing? Time box it, keep it short and sweet, and then communicate back what happened. Consistency, my point is consistency is what builds trust, not the size of the campaign, not the prizes. Cadence is the engine, if you want, but the quality of engagement really depends on the next step. So I hope this answers the question, which is the questions we ask. So the next tip is ask better questions. Use campaign modes, right? So what I've learned, as I mentioned in my previous experience as an innovation manager, is that one size fits all typically fails. So what we want to do is match the mechanism to the need. And so let me explain what I mean by that. Most of your engagement efforts are going to stall because the question's too generic, where we're just saying, share your ideas. And people don't know what that means. They don't know what's interesting. That's when you open yourself up to all of the off-topic, more tactical type ideas that I got. I got 739 ideas as the result of a share your ideas. All ideas are good ideas. And then I learned my lesson that not all ideas are good ideas. And if we don't help people understand our sweet spot, we're going to get everything under the sun. And I think what I learned through that experience is that people want to help, but they need something a little bit closer to their world to understand how it is that they can be helpful. And so what we want to do is share very specific prompts that unlock specific answers. So maybe some examples are, where are our customers getting stuck, right? Problem solving. What's slowing down our cycle time? So maybe asking them for some feedback. What should we stop doing? Where are we recreating work for ourselves? So these are all tactical, but I think the thing that I wanted to introduce the most were these 5 different campaign modes. What we have found works is exactly what Colin just alluded to. So if you think of these 5 simple campaign modes like a toolkit, you can use the right mode for the conversation that you're in, right? So creative is probably the most obvious. This is where we're looking to create brand new possibilities. Problem solving is more of your kind of continuous improvement bucket. So there we're trying to maybe fix some friction that we found in the organization or remove waste that exists. Discovery is all about looking for signals. What are you seeing? What's changing? Sometimes our R&D teams will use this when they've run into a roadblock, and they'll cast a wide net and ask, who knows something about us, about this particular topic that could help us overcome this obstacle that we've encountered. Testing is all about trying small experience and capturing what did we learn from that experience. And then last is feedback. So reacting maybe to a concept or a pilot, asking questions like, what would make it better? That the modes work because the magic is in the contract, right? We've got different themes, and each of those different themes has different promises or makes different promises to the audience. Saying something like, in 2 weeks, we're going to pick 5 winners is a completely different setup or different agreement than we're exploring themes and we're going to share what we learn. And when that matches the mode, matches the mode, people feel respected, they feel like they understand how they can contribute, and generally they show up. But even with the greatest questions, right, engagement can die if people don't see what happened. So the next tip is to make sure that we're closing the loop visibly. Participation is always going to follow credibility. This is one that most organizations underestimate. If people contribute and they hear nothing, the story then they tell themselves is that was a waste of my time, right? That was performative. And the next campaign that you run is going to cost you twice as much effort. Another hard lesson I learned when I was at CTCA, because I got so many ideas, I couldn't possibly react to them all. And so naturally people felt like they did what we asked them to do and no one was responding. And that was just because I had to weed through so much of the bad stuff to get to the good stuff. And so what we want to do is make sure we're closing the loop by publishing, publish the outcomes in some plain language. This is what we heard. This is what we're doing. This is what we learned. This is who owns it. Here's when we'll give you an update, right? One example that comes to my mind, and Colin and Chris, you guys probably have others, is worked with an organization that ran a two-week campaign where they just said, let's kill a stupid rule. And the biggest win wasn't the ideas that came in, it was the trust. So people saw leadership act. It happened quickly, it happened publicly, and that created momentum for the next initiative. And they were able to kind of start to stretch the audience into more exploratory or radical topics because they built that trust and they had the credibility that they would follow through.
And I think that sort of builds upon a comment in the chat here from Jesse, which is about the challenge often the executive only care about the day job. So it's difficult for people to invest beyond that. You're absolutely right, Jesse. From my perspective, unless the absolute top levels of leadership care about doing something differently, care about innovation, it's very difficult for the rest of the organization to feel like this is important. Actually, I find the bigger issue is the middle management layer, where the top level absolutely want to see the future of the organization protected. They want to see those new concepts emerging. The bottom layer want to contribute, but the middle layer isn't measured properly, isn't measured on innovation behaviors and innovation performance, and therefore you don't get that connection between the two worlds. I wanted to ask you, you kind of answered a question I was planning to ask you, Jennifer, but I wanted to ask you something different, which is related to some of the comments I've seen in the chat, which is the role of boundaries and making sure that people share the right kind of content. I'm sort of struck by, in a problem-solving campaign, it's been really clear what kind of boundaries there are, but in the more creative ones, we may need to offer pretty broad boundaries to encourage people to share broad and more adventurous things. And I wondered if you had any comments on that in terms of the role of where do we set the boundaries for what you share in terms of giving people permission or not to dream and imagine?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I work with clients that want more of the exploratory conversation, right? Like in that situation, I think it's more about setting the expectation, right? This is exploratory. We want to hear, what are the things you're thinking about? What are the things you're tinkering with? That's not a promise to fulfill those things or pull them through. And so in that case, I think it's okay sometimes not to set hard and fast boundaries. I just think the most important part about that is to make sure that we're setting the right expectation with the employee, that if they share, it doesn't mean we will be able to action this tomorrow. We're really just trying to do a little bit of discovery within the organization, for example.
Very good. Chris, any questions before we move on to your topic?
Yeah, I was just really thinking about engagement. It starts to sort of play with your mind, thinking what type of engagement, what's the currency of engagement. And then I started thinking about what is the one big thing, if one big lever you could pull to improve engagement. Jennifer, what would you say? I'm putting you on the spot here, but what's that one big thing you wish you could change?
To improve engagement? Yeah, I think it's twofold. So one, I think it's the humility of leadership, being able to ask for support, to say, I don't know, and I need your help. I think the other thing that's really important, and that I'm talking to clients about every day, right now, is this is the perfect time to go out and hunt for topics that are meaningful, right? So everybody's working on their strategic plans. Those strategic plans are likely published or will be published very soon. When we can go out and find topics on that strategic plan that we can support. So middle managers, for example, they'll have an OKR or a KPI or some sort of performance metric that they're working towards this year. We can almost go out and handpick the ones that we think that we can have an impact on, right? That's going to help with engagement because it's going to show that it's important to the organization. It's going to be aligned to what leaders care about, and even that middle manager crowd will care about. So it means the resources are probably available. There are plans to be able to pull these things through. And if it's close to home for the staff, that they understand why this is important, because it's most likely tied to their department in some way, shape, or form. And so I think that's a really nice starting point. But I'd love to hear your perspectives if you have different thoughts on that.
just meshing in with that discussion, I'm a big fan of accountability. I think it's always really missing, and I think if middle managers have accountability, to get the innovation train moving, then people sense that and they're more likely to engage. So for me, it's living the values, walking the talk, and having some level of accountability.
Yeah, maybe I can just build upon that, because I was in an interesting discussion just yesterday about what are appropriate measures for innovation for middle management. Typically they're measured on commercial things, so revenue, growth, impact, but and these are things, of course, at the executive level, that's what they care about the most. But there are certain situations where industries are prone to disruption, or if we don't move quickly, we are putting ourselves at risk for future disruptions if we don't create more agile enterprises. And it kind of led to a discussion, which is what is appropriate? How do you bring middle management with us on this process? Because without that, we can't create that accountability, right? And therefore, the audience doesn't believe in us. We don't have belief in the process. Doesn't believe we can execute, therefore it only shares certain things. So there was a comment earlier in the chat, I forget who was from, about people only sharing incremental ideas or smaller ideas. That typically means, assuming you're asking the right kind of a question, a venturous question, is they don't believe that you can execute on the more important stuff, which is typically where the C-suite started to come in, perhaps. And where we came to in terms of meaningful measures was to look at measuring the value of your innovation portfolio within your appropriate division or team. So knowing, what is it you're expecting to achieve from that innovation portfolio. So measuring that in the first instance is a good thing to do. Secondly, seeing if we can improve the likelihood of those numbers hitting. So actually improve the quality of that portfolio and increase the speed at which it can be executed. Speed is so crucial now in innovation. And if we put measures like those things on that middle to senior level, I think we would see a better set of behaviors around engaging people in innovation. It would be easier to engage people in innovation. So, a leader could say, well, I care about getting that thing to market faster, so let's engage my people on how I can do that. And then we've got a much stronger alignment between what the corporate wants, what the leader wants, and then what the employee can contribute to.
Yeah, I know we need to move on, but one of the things I was thinking about, sometimes when we get stuck with just tactical ideas coming in, it may come back to psychological safety, right? Like, have we demonstrated to the crowd that it's okay to take a risk? Do we celebrate failures or lessons learned visibly? I mean, that's one of the things I think you need to act consistently. You need to listen seriously. You need to act visibly, show the action. And then you need to recognize loudly. Recognize not just the ideas that were submitted, but maybe the comments that helped you avoid a misstep, right? That's important. Some people have a dare to try award, right? Where it's like, we didn't implement this, we're not ready for it, but what an amazing idea. When you can start to build that into the culture, you reduce the risk aversion, I think, that you see in people not wanting to look silly by submitting something that might be a little bit outlandish.
Yeah,
and
love that.
One last thing from me is that just jumped into my mind was my brother-in-law works for one of the big police forces, and his the chief constable is like all over innovation and collective intelligence and everything. He loves it, and he's modeling the behaviors, and therefore other people below him start modeling the behaviors as well. So there's two types of accountability that's hard coded. And then there's the softer accountability that comes from behaviors of people above. So I think that that's of huge help.
Agreed. Well, we best move on. Some fantastic observations and comments in the chat. So we're going to try and deal with them as best we can. I'm going to add a few questions as Chris moves into his zone. So we talked about the portfolio piece as being a critical thing for any organization to get right, so that we have that level of governance, we have that level of transparency. Yes, it will need to be some hierarchy in there to deal with it in the very largest organizations. And then Jennifer's talked about the ability to engage our people our greatest asset, and having them to deliberate, improve the quality of our innovation portfolio, input into it when appropriate, solve problems, validate, test things, incredibly valuable. But the other thing that we really need to address, and this is becoming more and more important, is our ability to listen well, our ability to absorb those external signals from outside the organization and make meaningful strategic decisions based upon them. Can we anticipate the future change better? So Chris, this is your hot topic for this year. Feel free to take us through it.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I'm getting immersed in this more and more often, and so what I decided to do was sort of link my talk to your portfolio discussion in a sense, and I wanted to emphasize the importance from the get-go of listening to external signals as a governance capability. Yeah, where you've got strong governance around portfolios. There's an interrelationship between listening to signals, and I'm going to hopefully demonstrate that. Before we get going, I must admit though, I thought that listening to external signals was really about trend scouting before I started to dig in, and I sensed it was a black art when I first looked at it. Soon realized it can be a white art. It isn't that difficult. It just you need to move from being probabilistic about it to deterministic about it, and I'll go on to explain what that means. So hopefully, after our little talk today, if your organization is not paying due attention to external signal listening, then hopefully you can start to set off on the right foot. What I always like to do is say, if you don't remember anything from this or revisit it or whatever, is just take two big takeaway ideas about listening. And it really is about how organizations notice change early before it becomes obvious, expensive, or irreversible. Also, think that it's about making leaders examine how attention flows in the organization. Lots of things going on in the organization, strategic this, data that, KPIs this, KPI that. But how does those people that are listening, they're out there in the field, bring that information in, and how's it processed? So let's think about redefining governance through listening. We often think of governance as structures, forums, decisions, but governance really begins earlier than that. Governance is the discipline of deciding what we listen to, what we ignore, and what we act upon. If you think about it, it's quite profound. So listening is not an input into governance, it is governance. So what does listening actually mean at a leadership level? As I say, I'm positioning this talk not about all the little discrete parts of what listening is and isn't. I'm trying to frame it within a governance capability lens. So leadership listening means noticing misalignment between strategy and behavior, paying attention to weak signals, not just validated metrics, treating, and here's an interesting one, discomfort, friction, and surprise as legitimate inputs. I think in business, things are going on, there's reports of this, that, and the other. We're seeing from our surveys and things, we start to feel uncomfortable. But if we're doing okay, we can quickly sideline that discomfort at our peril. So really, what this is all about is a governance failure pattern. So when listening breaks down, it usually breaks down in governance first. So the pattern we see is that often signals emerge at the edges. They're outliers. They also challenge and conflict with success narratives. They're filtered out as noise often, and governance forums reinforce certainty. Strategic risk accumulates quietly. So a little sort of phrase to think about: by the time governance notices, the market has already decided. So what I thought I'd do now, to try and take something that's a little bit sort of abstract, I've got a couple of examples. And I was surprised to learn about this example, actually, because I always thought Lego were like the blue-eyed boys of innovation and business success and trying lots of different things. And that's where they fell down. So Lego got a bit too big for their boots and started to put in all sorts of, I don't know, whiz bang, different shapes, started to clutter up their product offerings. And hey, guess what? They started to notice they had declining engagement, rising complexity, and these things were observable. They knew about it, but they were not privileged or prioritized. So privileged meaning they didn't seep in to the big discussions around the strategic table, shall we say. What they looked at was, and we can see it a mile off, innovation volume was rewarded. They're knocking out this, here's a bakery set, here's a Star Wars set, and that's what they believed in. So the lesson, if listening isn't designed into governance, the activity, knocking out new stuff, will always win. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the example about Skype. Use your imaginations. Where is Skype today? It's almost disappeared. But again, their disappearance was largely due to not listening to signals. I'm just going to zone in for a moment on another example that's quite interesting, and that's Gillette and its razors. I was quite surprised about this one. So Gillette were throwing innovation at the razors. We're going to have 10 blades, 15 blades, however many blades. We're going to have a maneuverable ball, this, that, and the other. And they kept charging a premium for products and for their products. And people started getting frustrated and started to lose trust and started to look at other things that were more simple, right priced, and weren't so highfalutin. So Gillette fell foul to this, to other new entrants into their market, who became emotional about Gillette's, you've locked me into this now, I've got to buy these expensive blades, I get a cheap blade and expensive this, that, and the other. Became very emotional about it. And this is the new entrants capitalized on that lack of trust and an emotional perspective. I'll just stop there. Colin?
Chris, I'm curious. I'm curious in these organizations, who's allowed to say, this might matter without proof? Who is allowed in this, kind of listening engine and the governance around it? Who are the people that are able to speak up?
Well,
in your experience.
Well, I don't have a lot of experience apart of this, but what I've learned, as it were, is that pretty much everyone, and I think if you don't tell the organization that it's okay to listen, and you might be bringing us uncomfortable truths, nobody will. Hey, guess what? Nobody will. And that leaves you very vulnerable. So you have to have a culture of people being able to let's say, almost have a backlog. They have to create a backlog, because you can't deal with every bit of input. But I think you need to start formulating a backlog of these nuggets that people are bringing. So the answer is everyone.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic, and great example from Antimo here in the chat about obviously Blockbuster and Netflix and the DVD market. I think that history is littered with organizations that seemingly stopped listening or never listened, and then when change happens, they didn't anticipate it and they couldn't react properly. And it strikes me that from what you said, Chris, there's sort of three major themes that could emerge from the signals that we're seeing. You could have a set of signals which actually reinforce your strategy. Okay, we know we're heading down the right path because we can see even more information about it. Second thing is might see a set of signals which actually create an entirely new area for us to explore. A new area for us to go and invent or innovate. But I think the most challenging part, and you've kind of begun to touch on this, is when the signals challenge the existing strategy, when they start to actually cause you to question it. And I wonder what happens in those circumstances. And as Jennifer said, who has responsibility for this, but from a structural perspective, is there a sensible way of bringing that challenge in, which is not stomping on people, but is actually part of a sort of systematic way of making sure that we sort of sanity check what we're doing? Because in this fast-moving world, by the time we've created something, the world may have shifted, and this listening piece is our check and balance, I suppose. Any comments on that?
Well, I think we're going to have to be ambidextrous when it comes to listening. As you said, you can use listening as a precursor to actually formulating the strategy. You can bring the listening in that can modify parts of the strategy, or what more often happens is it becomes uncomfortable and it's ignored. And therefore, I think we have to, own up to it as leaders and portfolio managers and strategists, that unless we bake the white art of listening into our DNA and the way we naturally go about things, then we're going to be vulnerable and we might get blindsided, because once these signals, once you ignore them and then they take hold, as I said earlier on, that they can be irreversible and cause, destruction.
And that leads me to another. Oh, sorry, Colin.
So yeah, I was just going to add one other thing, because I was asked recently I thought an interesting question, which was, how do we tell the difference between a weak signal that we can ignore and a stronger signal, which perhaps we should be paying attention to? And my feeling was that the odd piece of data, so a new technology emerges or a piece of customer feedback is not enough. What you really need is a cluster of signals, multiple verifiable points or combinations of signals. So there's a trend, a change in regulation, maybe a bit of customer feedback. That suddenly becomes much more interesting when you've got multiple signals that are taking you down that same path. That sound correct to you, Chris, or do you think we also need to really be careful about those weak signals that might turn into something eventually?
I think the weak signals are the ones to be most concerned about. I think that's where the value is on the weak signals. I think once you get to these strong signals, they're almost they're ready to morph into trends, and then you might have missed the boat.
Well, and then that leads me to my. Oh, I'm sorry, Chris. I was just going to say I have my thought immediately goes to, if it's a weak signal, how do you apply the resources to it and make sure that someone's responsible for following through on that signal, right? Like, at what point does a signal become someone's responsibility?
Fantastic question, because this is what this is. I think what I've detected and found out is that the companies really don't have the listening engines. They might say they do, but I think we've got to be better at baking these things into our new way of working. We have to own up to it that we're not doing the best job of processing these signals. And I think obviously we could do some brainstorming on what that might look like. But I think the best thing I heard is people setting up a backlog of the signal. So, capturing a system of record for signals, and as Colin said, starting to cluster them and making, drawing insights out of these clusters and synthesizing. And it's not easy. It takes a certain mindset, I think if, accountants or whatever, we all know about different thinking styles. I really do feel that the organization should try and identify people that can really deal with ambiguity and can also be really creative and use this, let's say, what is it? This stuff to then go knocking, banging the door down of the leadership and saying, we've got to course correct, or we're going to miss this opportunity.
Time is against us, I'm afraid. I want to quickly just summarize a few of the points that we've made. Thank you ever so much, everybody, for this great debate and all the good comments and questions in the chat. More than we can feasibly process, but I hope we got to a good chunk of those. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to give us some feedback on our webinars, we would love that. Just follow that QR code, put in a very quick survey, and then you can go into the hat for a free consultation if you so wish. And just to summarize what we talked about today, I kicked us off by explaining this sort of highly volatile, fast-moving, especially fast-moving technology landscape that we face here, having a clarity, some transparency over our innovation portfolios is critical. That's not necessarily taking the process flexibility away from the locale, but making sure that we have some view of what's taking our capacity and our money, and making sure that we can have a view of where the overlaps are, have a view where the gaps are, and also forecast effectively what the collective impact of our innovation activities are going to be. Maybe expressing our innovation portfolio like an investment portfolio to leadership, so we have much more sensible discussions about what we should focus on and whether we need to shift our approach. Jennifer then talked about engaging people in our programs using collective intelligence, involving people not just in idea generation, but problem solving, validation, getting to share expertise, and how crucial it is to build trust in that process. Only asking the questions that you actually have interest in solving, making sure we have that clear alignment between leadership and people, being humble and asking questions when you feel like you might need a broader set of contributions than that perhaps we can put in a room. And how if we go through that cycle time and time again, we can drive up those engagement levels from Gallup's survey you mentioned of 21%. And we've certainly seen some programs that hits 50, 60, 70, even 80% in certain cases by engaging people in that world of innovation. And I also wanted to pick out, there's a really good comment in the chat. Again, apologies, I forget who it was from, which was around language and how the word innovation sometimes disengages people. The buzzwords we put around this, we need to be really practical. If we want a problem solved, let's talk about problem solve. We want to identify risks, let's use that language. The word innovation is subjective and it means different things to different people. So we need to be pragmatic about that. And then a great observation at the end of this, to complete our 3 key tenets of planning for 2026, which is about becoming better listening organizations, being able to not just absorb, say, trends, but new technologies, new regulations, the stuff that people see at conferences, perhaps doesn't have a home, clustering that into meaningful areas, having a watching brief on the weak signals, to make sure that those things don't emerge into things that are really going to challenge our businesses. So I think if you're thinking about where you should put your energies in for 2026, if you can get those 3 things right, probably in the order that we've talked about them, you are going to put yourself in a position where you've got stronger foundations from which to move and make many other things that you might want to do about external engagements and better governance and adapting processes much more straightforwardly. So yes, there will be a recording available for all of those of you that attended. Thank you ever so much. Really great engagement and nice group of people. Thank you ever so much for your comments. Thank you to my co-supporters, Jennifer and Chris, and of course to Sonia to be providing technical support behind the scenes. We will be doing more of these types of sessions through the year, usually about 1 a month, avoiding holidays and the middle of summer. So you'll get to hear about those coming through, both on LinkedIn and probably in your inbox in due course. So appreciate you taking the time, and thank you so much.
Cheers. Bye.
Everyone.